Bellmoor was a village that never truly belonged to the living. Hidden deep in the Yorkshire moors, it sat shrouded in a perpetual mist that seemed to rise from the ground itself, thick, cold, and heavy with silence. The cottages leaned as though burdened by memory, and the cobblestones glistened with a dampness that never quite dried, no matter the season. The people there walked softly, spoke little, and crossed themselves each time the wind carried the toll of the church bell. At the centre of it all stood St. Anselm's church, a structure of grey stone and sorrow. Its spire loomed crookedly, as if trying to pierce through the fog, but forever failing. The walls were mottled with moss and the faint scent of old incense. Inside, time had stopped centuries ago. The pews creaked like bones, and the air carried that strange stillness found only in places that had witnessed too much prayer and too little grace. The man who kept watch over this place was Reverend Thomas Elwood, a vicar so devout that the villagers often whispered he had been born wearing his collar. He was a tall, solemn man with eyes the colour of pewter, neither warm nor cold, but unyielding. His sermons were known for their quiet fervour. He did not shout or rage like other preachers. Instead, he spoke as though confiding in something unseen, his voice a low murmur that seemed to come not from the pulpit, but from the walls themselves. For years, Reverend Elwood had been a figure of respect, even love. He had come to Bellmoor young and full of light, with a wife who matched his gentleness in every way. Eleanor Elwood was her name, a woman whose presence softened the severity of his world. The villagers adored her. She tended the sick, sang hymns in a voice that lingered in the rafters long after service, and greeted everyone, from the poorest farmer to the haughtiest landowner, with the same kindness. Together, they were the soul of the parish, a pair that seemed untouched by time or tragedy. But then came the winter of 1878, the winter that took everything. It began with whispers of a wasting illness that crept through the moor villages like fog. Some said it came from the marsh water. Others blamed the rats that infested the grain stores. Whatever its cause, it reached Bellmoor with quiet cruelty. Eleanor was among the first to fall ill. At first she brushed it off, a cough, a fever. But soon her strength began to fade. Her once rosy complexion grew pallid, her laughter dulled to faint sighs, and her eyes, once bright with life, dimmed like dying candles. The Reverend refused to accept it. He prayed over her night after night, his hands trembling as he read aloud from the Psalms, his voice breaking when the silence of the house pressed too tightly around him. Yet for all his prayers, her condition worsened. When she finally passed, the church bell tolled 13 times, one more than tradition allowed. No one had rung it. The villagers later claimed it was the wind, but the Reverend knew better. He had been inside the bell tower when it sounded. They found him there at dawn, his face streaked with tears and soot, his hands trembling. He told them she had died peacefully, and they buried her 3 days later in the churchyard, beside the yew trees. But in truth, that grave was empty, for on the night of her passing, Reverend Elwood had carried Eleanor's body up the spiral steps of the Belfry, believing, or convincing himself, that he could not bear to let her go. In his madness, he told himself he was preserving her soul, keeping her close to the sound of heaven's call. "She will rest among the angels," he whispered, as he laid her beneath the great bronze bell, wrapped in her wedding veil. "And when it tolls, it will wake her." Weeks passed, and life in Bellmoor tried to continue. The Reverend delivered his sermons with unshakable calm. To the villagers, his composure was a miracle. They pitied him for his loss, praising his strength. But those who lingered after Mass spoke of strange sounds, footsteps in the tower long after dark, whispers that echoed when no one was there, and the faint scent of lilies drifting through the nave, though no flowers had been brought in. Then, one night, the bell tolled again. It was not Sunday, nor any holy day. It rang slowly, mournfully, each note trembling through the fog like the voice of the dead. The villagers gathered outside in fear, staring up at the tower where a dim light flickered behind the slats. No one dared to enter. The next morning, Reverend Elwood claimed he had been praying, but the caretaker, old Mr. Pevensey, noticed something that chilled him to the bone. On the floor of the belfry there were footprints in the dust, small ones, bare and not belonging to the Reverend. Rumours began to bloom like rot. Children dared each other to touch the church door at midnight. Wives whispered that Eleanor's ghost walked the nave, her veil dragging through the aisles. Some swore that they'd heard her singing softly, the same hymn she'd sung on her wedding day, "Abide with me." Others said the bell no longer sounded like metal, but like a voice caught in grief. By spring, even the Reverend's sermons had changed. Gone were the gentle lessons of faith and mercy. Now he spoke of resurrection, of the body eternal, of souls that slept beneath the sound of the Lord's call. His eyes gleamed with feverish conviction. "She is not gone," he said one Sunday, his voice trembling. "The grave is only a veil, and the bell will lift it." The villagers watched in growing unease as his obsession deepened. Every night they saw his lantern glow from the belfry windows, swaying like a will-o'-the-wisp. The sound of rustling chains, the creak of the bell cease rope, it all became part of the village as restless nights. Then came the first true sign that something unnatural had taken hold. The caretaker's wife, Mrs. Groves, was sweeping the church one afternoon when she noticed the faint sound of humming, a woman's voice drifting down from the tower. Thinking it was the Reverend, she called out. The humming stopped. And then, just as she turned to leave, a single white lily fell from the rafters, landing at her feet. That night, the bell tolled 13 times again. By summer, the entire village avoided St. Anselm's after sunset. The few who passed by claimed the air around it felt colder, as if the church itself was drawing breath. The Reverend no longer visited homes or comforted the sick. He rarely spoke at all, except in murmurs directed at the tower. And then, on the eve of the harvest festival, a young boy named Samuel Hargreaves vanished near the churchyard. His lantern was found lying at the foot of the tower, still lit, but its glass covered in condensation from the inside. The villagers gathered, frightened and angry. "You must seal the belfry," Pevensey demanded. "It's cursed." But Reverend Elwood only smiled faintly. "The bell tolls for the faithful," he said. "It tolls for those who wait to be called." That night, the church bell rang again, not 13 times but 34. When morning came, the doors of St. Anselm's were found blocked from the inside. The villagers forced them open, only to find the pews covered in white feathers. And on the altar lay the Reverend's open Bible. Every page was blank except one. Written in a trembling hand, the words read, "She is awake." The morning after the words, "She is awake," were discovered, the entire village of Bellmoor seemed to fall under a hush so thick that even the crows abandoned the steeple. The church remained closed that day, the first time in memory that the Sabbath bell failed to toll. No one dared cross its threshold. Even those who had spent their lives kneeling before the altar felt an instinctive terror, as though God himself had turned his gaze elsewhere. It was decided, reluctantly, that the magistrate in Darrowby should be informed. But Bellmoor was small, forgotten, and far removed from the world of swift justice. The message took 3 days to reach the authorities, and another 2 before anyone arrived. In that time, something within the village began to unravel. Old Mrs. Groves claimed she could hear the sound of footsteps pacing the church at night. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the nave, as though someone were dragging a heavy garment along the stone. The blacksmith, Elias Morton, swore he saw candlelight flicker behind the belfry's slats well past midnight. And every morning, a faint dusting of white petals appeared on the church steps. Lilies again, though none had been planted in months. When the magistrate finally arrived, he brought with him a young constable named William Avery. The two men were practical sorts, unimpressed by talk of spirits. They insisted on a search of the church. The villagers refused to accompany them inside, so the men entered alone. The doors groaned as they pushed them open. Inside, the air was heavy, colder than it had any right to be in late summer. Dust hung like smoke in the beams of their lanterns. The pews were empty, but on the altar lay the Reverend's Bible, open once more to the same page. The words, "She is awake," had been smeared, as though by a trembling hand. Beneath them, faintly, another line had appeared overnight, "And he will ring for her again." The magistrate frowned and ordered Avery to inspect the tower. The young constable hesitated, but obeyed, his lantern flickering as he climbed the narrow spiral staircase. The air grew colder with every step. When he reached the belfry, he called down that it was empty, save for dust, cobwebs, and the enormous bronze bell that hung silent above him. Then the bell moved. It swayed slightly, though no wind touched it. Avery froze, staring upward as the clapper gave a single hollow strike. One note, deep and mournful, filled the church below. By the time the magistrate reached him, Avery was standing motionless, his lantern shattered at his feet. He insisted he had seen nothing, that perhaps a draught had set the bell to motion. Yet his hands trembled for hours after. That evening, word spread through the village like a fever. Some claimed the Reverend's spirit haunted the tower. Others whispered that Eleanor herself had returned, searching for the husband who had buried her among the bells. No one dared enter St. Anselm's again. But one man did not believe in superstition, not entirely. Dr. Alaric Fenn, a retired physician who had moved to Bellmoor after the death of his wife, was known for his rational mind. He volunteered to examine the church himself, arguing that madness often followed grief, and that perhaps the Reverend's mind, or someone else's, had gone astray. He arrived at dusk, bringing with him medical instruments, a notebook, and an air of quiet skepticism. The villagers watched as he disappeared through the church doors. Hours passed. Then sometime after midnight, the bell rang again, not once, but thrice. When morning came, the doors of St. Anselm's stood ajar. Dr. Fenn was gone. Inside, his notebook lay open on the first pew. Only one entry had been written hastily, in uneven script. "She sings when the bell moves." The disappearance of Dr. Fenn marked the beginning of the village's descent into quiet panic. Parents forbade their children from walking near the churchyard. The market emptied earlier each day. Even the livestock refused to graze near the western wall of the cemetery. Something unseen had taken hold of Bellmoor, something patient, persistent, and aware. And then, late one night, the vicar returned. No one saw him arrive. One moment the church was dark. The next, candlelight burned within the windows, and the soft murmur of prayer echoed from inside. When the villagers gathered the courage to look through the cracked doors, they saw Reverend Elwood kneeling before the altar, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes lifted toward the belfry. "Reverend," old Mr. Pevensey called softly. "We thought you were dead." Elwood turned slowly. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, yet there was no madness in them, only a terrible calm. "Death?" he whispered. "Death is nothing. She has shown me." He rose to his feet, the candlelight trembling across his features. "I have kept her safe, as I vowed before God. The bell will ring and she will rise. The Lord promised resurrection, and he keeps his promises." The men outside tried to reason with him, but he would not listen. When they forced the door open, the Reverend retreated toward the tower, clutching a small wooden cross. "You will not take her," he cried. "She sleeps above, listening." He disappeared up the staircase, his lantern bobbing in the dark. No one dared follow. Then came the sound, the heavy, unmistakable groan of the great bell moving. It began to toll, slow and steady, shaking dust from the rafters. But this time it did not stop. Each strike grew louder, until the air itself seemed to tremble. The villagers fled, covering their ears. From within the church came a low, rhythmic sound, like a woman's voice humming between the tolls. By dawn, the bell had gone silent. When the magistrate returned with help from Darrowby, they found the tower door bolted from within. After forcing it open, they ascended cautiously. What they found was not a body, but a scene that defied belief. In the corner of the belfry lay a tattered wedding veil, spread like a shroud across the floor. Beside it, Reverend Elwood's lantern burned low, the glass smeared with fingerprints. But of the man himself there was no sign, only the faint scent of lilies and the impression of a woman's bare feet in the dust, leading to the edge of the tower and stopping there. Below, in the churchyard, something had disturbed the earth near Eleanor's grave. The soil was loose, freshly turned, though the headstone remained untouched. The magistrate ordered the area sealed, but few dared to go near. One of the grave diggers, a man named Caleb Horn, swore that as they worked to fill the earth, he heard a sound beneath the soil, soft, rhythmic, and faintly metallic. Like a chain brushing against stone, he never returned to the site again. Weeks passed, and autumn fell upon the moors. The fog thickened and the nights stretched longer. The church stood silent, abandoned by all but the wind. Yet some evenings, when the mist rolled heavy over the graves, a single note from the bell would echo through the valley, and always, faintly, from within that sound, there came the whisper of a hymn. The story of Reverend Elwood did not begin in Bellmoor. It began 30 years earlier, in the cathedral town of Arlenford, where he was once considered a rising voice among the clergy, known for his eloquence, his sermons on purity, and his unshakable composure. Parishioners said he had a gift for making sin sound beautiful, for turning guilt into something sacred. But those who knew him well whispered that his faith was born of obsession rather than devotion, and that his marriage to Eleanor, a woman of quiet grace and fragile health, was not one of love, but of possession. Eleanor had been the daughter of a bell founder, a man who cast bronze for churches across England. It was said that when she first met Elwood, she wore a necklace fashioned from a small brass clapper engraved with a single word, resound. The Reverend found it charming, symbolic of calling the faithful. But to Eleanor, it was a reminder of her father's workshop, where molten metal roared like thunder, and where her childhood had been spent surrounded by sound and fire. In those early years, before the darkness took him, Elwood's sermons were filled with light. He spoke of resurrection, of eternity, of the voice of God carried through the toll of bells. He claimed that each note was a prayer made flesh, a bridge between the living and the dead. Parishioners found it moving, but Eleanor often left the pews pale and trembling. When the cholera outbreak came to Arlenford, the church was transformed into a place of dread. The sick were brought there to die, their cries echoing through the nave. Eleanor tended to them tirelessly, refusing to leave even as the disease spread. Elwood, consumed by fear of infection, sealed himself within the rectory. From his window, he watched her carry the dying one by one to the chapel floor, until finally, she too fell ill. It was said that her final words were not to her husband, but to the bell in the tower, "If he will not come to me, let the bell call him." She died before dawn. Elwood ordered her buried immediately. Yet after the funeral, he began to claim that she had spoken to him through the ringing, that each toll of the cathedral bell was her voice, crying out his name. His sermons grew erratic. He began to keep vigil beneath the tower, writing feverishly in his journals, filling page after page with prayers that read like incantations. The church council relieved him of duty. It was only through the intervention of a bishop, who pitied him, that Elwood was quietly transferred to a smaller parish in the countryside. That parish was Bellmoor. When he arrived, the church of St. Anselm's was crumbling, forgotten by its diocese. The belfry had long been condemned, the bell cracked from disuse. Yet Elwood insisted on restoring it. He claimed that a church without a bell was a body without a soul. He poured every coin and ounce of strength into rebuilding the tower, melting the old bronze and commissioning a new casting. He called it Eleanor. When the bell was raised, villagers said the sound of its first toll carried for miles, low and mournful, shaking the leaves from the trees. The Reverend wept openly beneath it. That night he refused supper and instead sat within the tower until morning, whispering to the shadows above. From that moment, The village began to change. The livestock grew restless. Wells soured. A heavy damp settled over the fields, clinging to the air even in sunlight. And through it all the bell continued to toll, sometimes without reason. Without wind, without a hand to pull the rope, the parish clerk, a timid man named Henry Alcott, once confided to his wife that the Reverend had given him strict instructions never to enter the tower. "She rests there," Elwood had told him, "and she must not be disturbed until the appointed hour." When Alcott asked who she was, Elwood merely smiled. "The church knows," he said. "It always knows." In time, whispers began to spread that the Reverend had remarried, or at least behaved as though he had. He was seen speaking softly to an unseen companion during his evening walks, pausing to hold open doors, or laying 2 plates at his table. Some claimed they heard a woman's voice answering him. Others believed the sound came from the bell itself. And then came the night of the storm. Lightning tore across the moor, striking the bell tower and setting the roof ablaze. The villagers gathered in horror as flames consumed the upper timbers. They called for Elwood, but he was already inside, shouting her name. The next morning, when the ashes cooled, they found 2 things amid the wreckage: the Reverend's wedding ring, melted and fused to the metal clapper of the bell, and a single lock of hair, untouched by flame. It was after that night that he built the new coffin. He did not bury it in the churchyard as law required. Instead, he carried it himself, step by step, up the tower staircase. When asked why, he replied, "Because the earth could not keep her. The air must." Years later, long after his disappearance, the journals of Reverend Elwood were found hidden beneath the altar. They were written in a hand that grew more frantic with each page. The earliest entries spoke of guilt and longing. But as the years passed, his words shifted from confession to invocation. One passage read, "The bell is her breath. Each toll is her heart. When it rings, she stirs." Another written days before he vanished, "I have heard her in the wind. She calls not for salvation, but for release. The clapper moves though no hand pulls. She is no longer beneath, she is within." When the investigators from the diocese read these entries, they dismissed them as the ramblings of a grieving mind. Yet one line in particular unsettled them. It was scrawled across the final page beneath a dried press of white petals. "At the last chime I will climb and open the hollow of her silence." No one ever learned what he meant. But years later, when restoration workers returned to Bellmoor to repair the tower, they uncovered something behind the bell itself. A narrow cavity, sealed with mortar. Inside lay remnants of a wooden box, splintered and water-stained, containing fragments of linen and a small brass clapper engraved with a single word: "Resound." The workers sealed the tower again that same day, but one of them, a young apprentice named Jacob Linton, took the clapper with him, intending to sell it for scrap. He returned home that night and placed it on his mantelpiece. By morning, the house was empty. The hearth was cold, the door unlocked, and where the clapper had rested, there was only a faint ring of soot and the smell of lilies. From that day onward, the bell of Bellmoor has remained silent. Yet when storms sweep across the moors and thunder rolls through the valley, travellers still claim to hear its echo, a deep, aching sound that lingers long after the wind has passed. They say it rings not for the living, but for the vow the Reverend made and could never break. And if you listen closely, beneath the toll, you might hear another voice, softer, distant, and eternal, whispering the same word that began it all: resound. By the turn of the century, Bellmoor had all but disappeared from the maps. The moor road that once led travellers to St. Anselm's had been reclaimed by heather and stone. Those who lived nearby avoided the valley entirely, claiming that the fog there never lifted, not even in summer. What remained of the village was little more than ruins and silence, the church tower rising from it like a monument to sorrow. It might have stayed that way, forgotten, if not for the arrival of the new vicar. In 1912, the Church of England appointed Reverend Charles Pembroke to oversee the district parishes, including Bellmoor. He was a man of modern faith, confident, rational, and determined to restore what he called the dignity of God's house. To him, the legends surrounding the old church were nothing more than remnants of pagan superstition. "A bell cannot haunt," he told the parish council, "but ignorance can." Against the advice of locals, Pembroke and a small team of labourers reopened the path to St. Anselm's. The church was in ruin. Ivy strangled the walls, and the pews were blanketed in moss. The once proud bell tower leaned at a strange angle, its wooden steps rotted with age. But Pembroke saw potential. He planned to restore the chapel, reconsecrate the grounds, and once more let the sound of worship echo across the valley. The restoration began that spring. For weeks, the workers cleared debris, removed dead birds from the rafters, and repaired the cracked stone floor. At first it went well, but on the fourth week, a mason named Harrow slipped while working beneath the tower. As he fell, his cry was drowned out by a sudden, deafening clang from above. The bell, silent for over 30 years, had tolled once. No one had touched the rope. When they rushed to the belfry, they found the rope torn and frayed, as if something heavy had yanked it from within the walls. The workers refused to continue. Pembroke dismissed it as coincidence. "A gust of air," he said. But that night, as he examined the ledger in the rectory, he heard a faint humming drifting through the open window. A woman's voice. The next morning, he climbed the tower alone. The air was thick with dust, the timbers creaking under his weight. At the top, the great bell hung motionless, yet the air around it seemed to vibrate. When Pembroke reached out to touch the bronze, the surface felt warm. Beneath his fingers, he noticed an engraving, worn and nearly invisible, that read, "Eleanor." The name meant nothing to him at the time. That evening, he wrote to the diocese, requesting permission to recast the bell. "It is unfit for service," he explained. "Cracked, unstable, and a relic of a darker age." The request was granted. The foundry arrived 2 weeks later. On the morning they attempted to lower the bell, a dense fog rolled in from the moors, so thick the men could not see their hands in front of them. Still, they worked by lantern light, fastening ropes and pulleys. But when they struck the first hammer against the beam, the bell let out a sound, not a toll but a low, metallic groan that seemed almost alive. Every man froze. Then from somewhere deep inside the church, another sound answered it, soft, rhythmic, like the beating of a heart. By noon, the fog had lifted. The men refused to return. The bell remained hanging, swaying gently in the sunlight. Reverend Pembroke dismissed them, deciding to finish the inspection himself. That evening, villagers saw him standing in the belfry, staring at the bell as the sun dipped below the horizon. They never saw him come down. When a search party arrived the next morning, the tower was empty. Pembroke's lantern was found still burning beside the bell, its flame unbroken. His notes lay on the floor below, pages fluttering in the draught. The final entry read, "It moved." After Pembroke's disappearance, the diocese ordered St. Anselm's sealed permanently. The tower doors were chained, and a wooden cross was nailed across the entrance with the words "Dominus Silentium," "The Lord is silence." For decades afterward, Bellmoor was left to the elements. The church became a ruin once more, its walls slowly consumed by moss and fog. Locals warned travelers not to approach, especially after dusk. Shepherds reported hearing faint tolls during storms, always 13 in number. Some swore they saw a woman's figure pacing near the tower, her white gown fluttering in the wind. In 1951, a team of architectural historians visited the site. They were cataloguing medieval churches for preservation grants, and St. Anselm's appeared on an old diocesan list. Among them was Dr. Arthur Harland, a man fascinated by ecclesiastical folklore. He found the stories of Bellmoor amusing, a rural ghost tale dressed in vestments, as he called it. Harland's team documented the ruin for 3 days. On the final evening, as he examined the base of the tower, he noticed a section of stone, darker than the rest, as if stained by centuries of soot. Behind it, the wall sounded hollow. Curious, he marked it for later inspection. That night, a storm swept through the valley. The team took shelter inside the church, their lanterns flickering as thunder rolled overhead. Then precisely at midnight, the bell rang once. Dr. Harland recorded the event in his journal. The note was low, resonant, and unlike any I have heard. It carried warmth, not in tone but in presence. It felt as though the sound had entered my bones. When the storm passed, they found the stone Harland had marked had cracked open. Behind it lay a small cavity filled with damp earth and fragments of rotted wood. Within, half buried in the soil, was a human hand, skeletal, its bones bound together with rusted wire. They sealed the church again at dawn. But Harland could not forget what he'd seen. He returned alone months later, claiming he wished to complete his report. His final entry, never published, was found years after his death among his personal papers. It is not the wife who waits, nor the vicar who rings. It is the vow between them, alive and hungry. The church remains closed to this day. Locals still avoid the valley, but hikers who wander too close to Bellmoor claim that the air feels heavier there, as though filled with sound just beyond hearing. Some nights, if the wind is still, a single tone hums across the moor, deep, sorrowful, almost human. Those who hear it say it vibrates in the chest, lingering long after it fades, and sometimes, if one listens too closely, a second sound follows. Not another bell, but a voice, soft and pleading, whispering through the fog, "Ring for me once more." By the dawn of the 21st century, St. Anselm's had faded from memory once more, a forgotten ruin swallowed by ivy and time. The last official mention of Bellmoor Church appeared in a 1978 Heritage Survey, which dismissed it as structurally unsound and culturally irrelevant. No one had stepped inside for nearly 70 years, until in 2006, a group of architecture students from Leeds decided to visit the site for their postgraduate project. Their assignment was simple: document examples of neglected Gothic revival structures. But their curiosity about Bellmoor was not architectural. One of them, a young historian named Emily Warren, had found an obscure reference to the church in a Victorian sermon collection, a marginal note written in faded ink beside. Psalm 130, "She rings when he forgets." It was signed only with the initials E. They arrived in early November, the valley heavy with mist. The road was nearly impassable, and the tower rose out of the fog like a monument carved from shadow. The iron chains that sealed the belfry door were still in place, though rusted through. Emily's team, 4 students in total, set up camp inside the nave. They planned to photograph the architecture and leave by morning, but as evening fell, the fog grew so dense that they decided to stay overnight. The air was cold and still, thick with the scent of mold and wet stone. Around 11 p.m., they lit a small fire in the hearth and began recording audio notes for their project. The recorder picked up faint background noise, soft vibrations, like a heartbeat deep within the walls. At first, they assumed it was the wind, but the rhythm did not change. Sometime past midnight, the recorder captured something else, a single resonant toll. The group froze. No one had touched the bell rope, and the wind outside was silent. The sound came again, lower this time, longer. They rushed to the belfry door, shining their torches through the cracks. The air smelled faintly of iron and lilies. One of the students, a technician named Oliver, swore he saw a shadow move across the stairs, though there was no light above to cast it. Despite Emily's protests, they forced the door open. Inside, the wooden steps spiraled upward into darkness. Each step groaned under their weight as they climbed. The higher they went, the warmer the air became, until the chill of the night was replaced by a suffocating heat that seemed to pulse from within the tower itself. When they reached the top, they found the bell still hanging, massive, tarnished, motionless. But the rope attached to it was frayed and moving, swaying as though tugged by invisible hands. Beneath the bell, carved into the wooden platform, were 2 words. "Forgive us," Emily shone her torch along the edge of the bell. For the first time, she noticed the inscription, Eleanor. The name gleamed faintly in the light. "It's just bronze oxidation," Oliver muttered, but his voice trembled. They began to descend. That was when the bell rang again. This time, it did not sound like metal. It sounded like breath, drawn from the lungs of the tower itself. The vibration shook the timbers, scattering dust and ash. The group ran, the recorder still rolling. It caught a final whisper before the sound collapsed into static. "He promised me forever." The next morning, hikers found the group's abandoned equipment just outside the church. The camera batteries had all been drained, but the recorder still held a faint pulse of sound, a slow, rhythmic hum, almost melodic. None of the students were ever found. 2 years later, in 2008, a sound archivist named Dr. Rowan Marks received the recorder as part of an anonymous donation. Curious, he digitized the tape. For the first 20 minutes, it contained nothing but static and faint whispers of wind. But at precisely 12:03 a.m. in the recording, the hum returned, layered, resonant, like the overtones of a great instrument. Marks isolated the sound using spectrogram analysis. When visualized, the frequencies formed a pattern, an irregular waveform that, when mapped against historical church records, matched the harmonic structure of a bell from the late 1800s cast in Arlandford, the same foundry that had once produced the bell for Bellmoor. Marks's research grew obsessive. He discovered that the Arlandford foundry had been destroyed in a fire in 1883, the same year Reverend Elwood was transferred to Bellmoor. He also learned that the bell had been commissioned under a different name, E. Whitlow, Eleanor Whitlow, daughter of the bell founder. When Marks shared his findings with colleagues, they dismissed him. But he continued his work in secret, convinced that the sound was more than an echo, that it carried something imprinted within the bronze itself. "A voice preserved in vibration," he wrote, "like memory cast in metal." On the anniversary of the student's disappearance, Marks returned to Bellmoor to record ambient sound. He set up his equipment at dusk and waited. The air was perfectly still. At 11:47 p.m., he noted a subtle change in pressure, followed by a faint ringing that seemed to come from beneath the ground rather than the tower. He moved closer to the belfry door. The door was ajar. He entered, his camera light sweeping across the cracked stone. The rope hung perfectly still. But as he approached the center of the room, his recorder picked up something else, not ringing, but whispering. Dozens of voices, layered and distant, rising and falling in uneven rhythm, then silence. The next entry in his field journal was unfinished. "I touched the bell. It's warm." Dr. Marks vanished that same night. The only trace left behind was his recorder, found 2 days later by a hiker. The final 30 seconds of the tape were released online by an anonymous source. It became a viral curiosity among paranormal researchers, known as the Bellmoor tone. Most listeners describe it as a faint chime that fades into the sound of rain. But a few claim to hear more, a woman's voice whispering softly beneath the noise. Audio engineers who isolate the frequencies say the words are almost impossible to discern. But if one slows the playback to half speed, the phrase becomes clear enough to recognize, "He never buried me." In 2017, the British Heritage Office conducted one final survey of the Bellmoor site. The report was never made public, but a note from the internal memo was leaked. It stated that the church had been demolished due to safety concerns. Yet the demolition crew later reported that the bell could not be removed. The metal had fused to the stone itself. When the tower finally collapsed, workers claimed to hear a single low note reverberate through the ground, lasting nearly 40 seconds. The sound was recorded on several of their phones. The frequency measured 26 hertz, below the human threshold of hearing, yet capable of inducing feelings of dread, nausea, and Zorro infrasound, the voice of the unseen. The Bellmoor site remains fenced off today, swallowed by the moor. Locals say no birds fly over it, and on cold nights the mist seems to rise, not from the ground but from within the earth. Those who trespass there describe hearing a faint vibration beneath their feet, like something vast turning in its sleep, and yet when the wind is still, the air carries a sound unlike any other, a single tone, long and mournful, echoing over the empty valley. Some call it the ghost of a bell, others call it the last breath of a vow. No one knows if Reverend Elwood's soul still lingers in the ruins, or if Eleanor's voice still calls for him through the silence. But there are those who swear that on certain nights, you can stand where the tower once rose and hear two voices intertwined in the wind, one pleading, one answering, forever caught in the toll of eternity, a union that neither death nor God could silence, and if you listen long enough, beyond the moan of the earth and the whisper of the reeds, you might hear the faintest echo of that word again, the word that began it all, and the one that will outlive them both, resound.